The viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, the sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your place in the dark for harmony and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland, and welcome one and all to Night Fright. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of choice going, folks. We've got a longtime friend returning tonight to talk about JFK and his work with some serious investigators and authors. For the past 2.5 years, Alan Dale's been serving as a research assistant to guess who? None other than Dr. John M. Newman. Yeah, has he got some stuff for us tonight, Alan does. He has co-hosted JFK Facts Online with renowned investigative journalist and author Jefferson Morley. And folks, fans of the show will know that in the www.nightfrightshow.com archives, you'll find Jeff's show there with me as well. He is also a contributing editor and director of the Assassination, Archives, and Research Center, and he is host of an online interview program which can be found at jfkconversations.com. And of course, all those links, folks, will be at a focal point on the www.nightfrightshow.com website. It is my great pleasure to welcome back to the show the one, the only, Alan Dale, who's my personal best buddy.
Yeah.
So, thanks for showing up and being a nice guy. That's very nice of you.
Happy to be with you.
Shall we start off with some of the work you've been doing with Dr. John Newman? I mean, this is incredible. How did this come about that you connected with him and you become his main research assistant?
Well, if there's a short version, and I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a main anything. I do have the privilege of working very closely with him for a couple of years now on materials that are relevant to his work. And he's engaged in very ambitious and very difficult work at this point in his life. He was deeply invested in being an historian and an investigator, really for the last 25 years, but at some point, within the last 12 years or so, he decided to get out of the game, and that didn't last very long. He made a consequential decision to get back in the game, and it was, either stay out or be all in, and he made, really to our ultimate benefit, he made a very difficult decision and chose to be all in. I met him 25 years ago and spent some, what was for me, some incredibly valuable, important time with him while he was promoting the work that brought him to international attention, and that was JFK and Vietnam. Dr. Newman, at the time, was an active duty major, an Army intelligence officer. What is referred to, his actual technical title, I believe, was a strategic intelligence cryptologic analyst for the United States Army Intelligence. And that position led to his introduction to the head of Army Intelligence, General William Odom, who accepted an appointment to the National Security Agency and chose, of all the people that he could have drawn into his immediate circle, because obviously General Odom had, he had access to everybody in the service. He could have chosen whomever he wanted. He chose Dr. Newman to be his executive military assistant for the next 2 years during General Odom's, he's also a PhD, internationally renowned academic and an extraordinary scholar in his own right. General Odom chose to have Dr. Newman serve as his executive military assistant during his period as the director of the National Security Agency. So these are very unusual qualifications for any human being, and for him to have become, through a series of extremely improbable and serendipitous crossroads, proverbial forks in the road, a series of them, and with the influence of his mentors, which includes General Odom and Dr. Richard Thornton, who was his primary professor in his college career. Dr. Newman has really kind of paved a road and extended a road that was introduced to all of us by Professor Peter Dale Scott. So I honestly, as I've said to you probably more than twice, I personally see, I'm certainly not alone, Dr. Newman is the first one to acknowledge it, that Professor Scott really is a person whose work was extremely influential in terms of helping to illuminate direction for people like Dr. John Newman and Bill Simpich and Jeff Morley and innumerable important and disciplined and extremely serious and extremely cautious scholars.
Renowned Canadian, by the way.
Who's that? Brent, I'm sorry, I missed. Do you have a comment? I don't know to whom you're referring.
Peter Dale Scott heralds from the same city that I do in Canada. Montreal.
Oh, is that Montreal?
Right, Montreal.
I had no idea. This is the first I've ever heard of this.
Alan and I have this ongoing thing where I bug him. He's in D.C., right? And I'm in Canada, and I always bug him. I always tell him I'm going to send him a hockey stick or a hockey puck, things like that. And Alan refuses to come to Canada because he has an aversion to hockey. So what can I tell you? But I'll go to D.C. because I don't have an aversion to DC.
I'm sure you can rightfully be proud of the fact that among many other notable Canadians, such as the great Oscar Peterson, Diana Krall, and don't forget Lorne Greene of Bonanza, and William Shatner, for that matter, Professor Scott is indeed a native of Canada, but I'm quick to point out that he left Canada and went to Poland, and then he went to California, where he served, had a most distinguished career, and is Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley, which was ground zero during the countercultural movement of the 60s.
Still Canadian, though. Anyways, okay, let's talk about Dr. John Newman's. What's it like working with a highly, you're right there on the cutting edge of all this new research that's coming out. Let me just name some of the books he's written. JFK and Vietnam, Deception, Intrigue, and the Struggle for Power. Now listen to what Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said about this book. A former special assistant to Kennedy called it the most solid contribution yet to speculation regarding the course of American history had the president not been assassinated. Isn't that incredible? What a comment.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable. Now, he's also written Oswald and the CIA, the documented truth about the unknown relationship between the U.S. government and the alleged killer of JFK. Quest for the Kingdom. This is kind of a different perspective for him, a different, what's the word I'm looking for? Different journey for him. Thank you. Quest for the Kingdom, The Secret Teachings of Jesus in the Light of Yogic Mysticism, and, of course, Where Angels Tread Lightly, The Assassination of President Kennedy, Volume 1. What's the title of Volume 2, Alan?
Countdown to Darkness. We've had an extraordinary period of productivity. Dr. Newman worked very hard to update his Volume 1, Where Angels Tread Lightly, so that as of late January of this year, 2017, he published an updated version of Where Angels Tread Lightly, he published Volume 2 in his continuing series on the assassination, which is called Countdown to Darkness, The Assassination of President Kennedy, Volume 2, and he did the Herculean project of updating and expanding this most consequential book from 1992 that really set his course in motion, and that is JFK and Vietnam, second edition. You quoted Arthur Schlesinger Jr. There was also a quote from William Colby, Bill Colby. He was director of consequence following Richard Helms, DCI, Director of Central Intelligence. And this was really one of the things that got a lot of people's attention back when the book was making waves. The book had really kind of an extraordinary impact, in part because of the careful and extraordinary depth of knowledge and the scholarship of its author, Major John Newman. And so William Colby, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, person responsible for the release of what they refer to as the family jewels, the person who fired James Angleton, a person who was very deeply engaged in Southeast Asia while the Kennedy administration was dealing with the subject of Vietnam. William Colby said this about JFK and Vietnam: a brilliant, meticulously researched, and fascinating account of the decision-making which led to America's long agony in Vietnam. Mr. Newman has added to our history and hopefully our modesty as we approach the decisions of the future. William E. Colby, former director, Central Intelligence Agency. Now, you know, the fact that Colby and Professor Schlesinger both wanted to go on record to draw attention to this man's work at that point in late 1992, that's the kind of attention, you know, positive review from Kirkus, front page New York Times book review, positive review there, innumerable other accolades by very, very serious people. Had also an awful lot of people who thought that they were knowledgeable, who were distressed to have to confront better scholarship and deeper research than that for which they had been responsible. So there were a lot of, you know, people. I wrote a review about it on Amazon, and I said, basically, I said, if I may quote myself, because, you know, what the hell, I said the story of the story is critical. And this is relevant to the fact that the book, Brent, was pulled after 5 months, and it no longer became available. And I know you've discovered this because you and I have talked about this privately. This is a book that made front page news all over the country and was endorsed by people of the stature of Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and William Colby, and the publisher pulled it. And so my review is as follows. I said, the story of the story is critical. The publication of JFK and Vietnam in 1992 did more than create controversy and ignite a media firestorm. Its basic thesis that President Kennedy was opposed to sending U.S. combat forces to Vietnam and would have averted the terrible war and its consequences was denounced by some and applauded by others. The book was given sufficient thoughtful attention by a few, which would change the nature and scope of the argument over what would he have done if he had lived, while being attacked and defended during the initial period following publication. It was singled out and praised by former DCI William Colby and former Special Assistant to President Kennedy, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., adding credibility to the idea that up until that time, the story had never been presented with such detail, authority, or documentation. In 1992, JFK and Vietnam received high praise from Publishers Weekly and Kirkus Reviews. It was featured and recommended on the front page of the New York Times Book Review. The book garnered nationwide attention for a time. That time was cut short by the demonstrable suppression of the book by its publisher, Warner Books. after first surviving a very serious threat of intervention to block publication by a federal agency. Within 5 months, JFK and Vietnam was pulled from the shelves, found to be unavailable for purchase anywhere, and left its author unable to communicate with the publisher's representatives. They stopped returning his calls. Not since the Pentagon Papers has there been such an attempt to deny the American public access to a book about Vietnam. Without a serendipitous encounter between the author and a distinguished member of a distinguished American family, the story of the book itself might well have ended as abruptly as it began. It is our very good fortune that the story did not end there. The publisher returned the legal rights of the book to its author, and 25 years later, we have JFK and Vietnam, second edition. And then I continued, but basically that tells the story that people who were introduced to the book during that first period immediately following publication, and who saw the kind of press that it brought in, innumerable articles in the Washington Post and all over the place about this extraordinary young scholar who was an active duty Army intelligence officer. This got the attention of some major figures, and in spite of that, or perhaps because, the book got pulled. So the story of the story has only now been published in the second edition, and it's something that I consider to be very important.
Are you up against is Dr. Newman up against the same type of roadblocks with the second edition that he was with the first?
No, he was going a formal route through a major publisher, Time Life and Warner Books. That was a big deal. And without going into a lot of detail about other things, which might be relevant to the story that ultimately Dr. Newman would have to choose to either speak about or not, really, if you want to know about it, it's the part that's relevant to his personal experience and how odd the story becomes, immediately after all of this positive press, is quite a story unto itself. And the other thing, of course, relevant to JFK and Vietnam is the book was published, and prior to publication was introduced to former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and that began an extraordinary personal experience for each of them. Because the book brought the two of them together, and it became, as I always say, it was a very consequential period for each of them. And so JFK in Vietnam was important then. It's every bit as important now.
Has he ever been able to ascertain why they pulled it? Was there a specific reason? Was there somebody behind it?
There are lots of ways
in the book that it just had to be suppressed.
Well,
but obviously ruffled feathers.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go in a confined space in terms of trying to address, your question. It's a good question. It's a very legitimate question, and people who are students of America during the Cold War, of America pre and post Watergate, will arrive at their own conclusions depending upon the extent to which, they choose to invest the necessary time in very difficult areas. But I think, the best thing that an historian can do is to go out on a limb and then make a case, which is then submitted for, the proverbial peer review that publication represents. Make a case for something that either overturns an orthodoxy or introduces new facts or does both. JFK in Vietnam did both of those things. It overturned the orthodoxy that our nation tells itself and teaches its children, that President Kennedy's assassination did not disrupt the continuity of his foreign policy, especially with regard to Vietnam, and that Lyndon Johnson basically just picked up where JFK left off. Turns out that's false. And JFK and Vietnam presents us with the necessity of confronting the proof that is a part of this story.
What was behind the Vietnam War, according to the book?
Look,
30
we would be
seconds.
here.
No, I'm kidding.
No, I don't. Yeah, right. See, you're funny. I would say that
I guess what
attempting.
I'm getting
I
at
would
was there.
say
What were
that
the machinations? Is there, very common?
I blame Teddy Roosevelt. No, really, Thomas Jefferson is where you have to go if you want to find somebody who sends American people out to do military things far away. Talk to General Charles de Gaulle, and then talk to General Giap of the North Vietnam Army, or read everything that Ho Chi Minh wrote.
Okay. Was there?
But it's
But keeping it
complicated.
going, was there a military-industrial complex? Was there this deep state that is so common now for everybody to say? Was there fake news going on? I mean, we hear
Here's
this
what
all the time today.
I hear what you're saying, and here's the way I'm going to address this, because I'm far away, and you can't throw anything at me.
Oh, you haven't seen my slap shot, buddy.
Here's what I want to say about it. I had a conversation with my most valued friend, Professor Peter Dale Scott, and he smiles quietly while people talk about how horrible the Donald Trump era is in the United States of America right now, because suddenly a lot of people have determined that something's wrong. And the reason that Professor Scott, can smile quietly to himself is that things being, wrong did not start with the ascension to the presidency of Donald W. Trump, or whatever his middle name is. I think that the answers to your questions
It's
are
S, isn't it?
very.
I think W was the other Republican.
Yeah,
president.
I'm probably aware of that. That may have been
Sorry to interrupt you.
kind of not a great attempt at humor. So, I mean, there are temporary residents of the White House, but what Professor Scott, would refer to as the deep state, probably, and how he differentiates between parapolitics and deep politics, and all of the story of trying to come up with terminology that is appropriate for some mechanism by which the constitutional system of governance has been transcended but is included within something else. So something else at work did not start either when President Eisenhower on January 17th of 1961 referred to the unwarranted influence, either sought or unsought, of the military-industrial congressional complex. It didn't start when President Kennedy was murdered in broad daylight 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days into his administration. And it did not start with people being suspicious that maybe Hillary Clinton was not a good choice if we were looking to address whatever seems to be going terribly wrong. So, the basic question that you're asking is an important question, and it really is simply an examination of the nature of power as it was being exerted through military and covert mechanisms during the period of the Cold War. So we're really focusing with Dr. Newman's work on the decisions, the years leading up to JFK, and throughout his period in office and in the immediate aftermath of his assassination. So, I would say that if a person who examines all of this work deeply, and I'm very much a proponent that people might choose to invest the necessary time, the necessary money, and the necessary effort to absorb what Dr. Newman is presenting to us, you will be rewarded by having a much deeper and much better understanding of the context and the composition of the fabric of the national security establishment, because politicians, by and large, are just sort of temporary players on a stage where the theater itself is built, is the structure within which action is initiated and plans are acted upon, which may not be legal and which may be counterintuitive. The strange bedfellows that bring together the mafia and organized crime for the purpose of assassinating a foreign head of state. These are not things for which we are well equipped. Certainly the World War II generation, people who thought in terms of, knowing who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, and, having maybe a strong sense of patriotic responsibility, because we knew that we were the good guys, and that once you get into the complexities behind the scenes, National Security Council, special group augmented, and the details and records, you come to a point where you are learning gradually why President Eisenhower. This is a question I hardly have ever heard anybody ask. People frequently refer to that speech, the military-industrial complex speech, January 17th, 1961, 3 days before JFK is inaugurated, right? Why did Dwight Eisenhower, who'd been the supreme commander of Allied forces for the last 2 years of the war, two-term president, why was he discussing that? Why did he choose that final occasion to address the citizens of the United States? Why did he want to emphasize this particular thing? Well, if you want to know, I can recommend the work of Dr. Newman on this important subject, because we're a long way in terms of approaching the investigation of President Kennedy's assassination. We're a long way, a couple of years and many miles from DEALEY PLAZA. So, to do a proper investigation, it requires a lot of background and a very close analysis of what happened leading up to Dallas.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
Is JFK and Vietnam in the book, does he address the fact that perhaps Vietnam was part of the reason that JFK was assassinated? I don't think he was assassinated. We've talked about this for just one single reason. I think there was multiple reasons behind it. Does he address that in the book?
JFK in Vietnam is not designed very deliberately. It doesn't take it upon itself to address the subject of President Kennedy's assassination. It does, however, provide everybody who's interested in the subject of President Kennedy's assassination with the most depth and the greatest detail ever published in this country on the subject of the Shakespearean or Machiavellian complexities at work within a divided administration, where the President of the United States, who is the chief executive, who is authorized by the Constitution to be the responsible party, has some difficulties, let's say, trying to take control of his the things that are for which he is responsible and that he's supposed to be able to influence. So I'll go back just because I think it's relevant, because I've already written it. I'll quote this review that I wrote of JFK in Vietnam. I said, JFK in Vietnam, second edition, should be publicized and promoted so that every student, every teacher, every citizen who volunteers for military service, and every aspiring politician will know the many false calculations, mistakes, manipulations, deceptions, and intrigue which led to the Vietnam War. This essential work examines in detail the Shakespearean machinations of deception and counter-deception that took place in the hidden maneuverings of a president who was determined to avoid being trapped and determined to never again repeat the mistakes of the Bay of Pigs. Dr. Newman documents President Kennedy's navigation of a dangerous course through Cold War hotspots and a very divided administration. What eventually emerges is an astonishingly dishonorable deception, a deliberate attempt to manipulate the President of the United States to authorize a war policy to which he was fundamentally opposed. This is more than JFK and Vietnam. It is JFK and Laos, JFK and the Pentagon, JFK and the CIA, JFK and the national security establishment as it evolved during the years preceding his election. The president recognized and responded to a clever adversary during the 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days of his administration, which acted within 48 hours of his violent death in Dallas to reverse his policy on Vietnam and throw America headlong into the tragic war that ensued. 5 stars, highest recommendation. That's the conclusion of my review of JFK and Vietnam, second edition.
Why would they do that, Alan? Just from your perspective, your opinion, why would they go back on JFK's policy of pulling all those, if you will, trainers out of Vietnam and go back on that policy and all of a sudden they're going to go full force? Is that Johnson's own doing, or was there something actually controlling Johnson as well at that point? Were there strings attached to Johnson pulling him in that direction?
Of course, we live in what is described to us as a democratic republic, and it's not a monarchy. So anyone who would suggest that there are no forces being exerted on Lyndon Johnson relevant to the same issues that confronted and challenged President Kennedy would kind of, not be making, I think, a legitimate case. But the issues about personalities and, corruption, our friend Professor Joan Mellon has written a book that I recommend called Faustian Bargains about LBJ, and she dispels some urban legends, which I think it's always a good idea to dispel mythologies.
Can you talk about the Mac Wallace fingerprint that she dispelled?
I'm going to let her talk about that because I'm only going to go as far as say that I recommend the book. I have read the book and I've spoken with her extensively about it. But really, the minutia of something like the technicalities about, hey, it turns out there is no match to be made with that claim of identifying the fingerprint. Yeah, that's enough for me because I'm less interested in the forensic stuff and in who was standing next to whom in Dealey Plaza based upon fuzzy photographs and stuff like that than I am about the kind of big picture questions that you're asking. And I would say that in all honesty, this is a work in progress for any thoughtful person. It raises very serious questions about where we live and how power is exercised during this period. It didn't start with Donald Trump, so there are really important questions to be addressed about how did we get to Donald Trump. You and I speak privately about how, apart from the problems that I personally would have with the perpetuation of the proverbial status quo with someone like Hillary Clinton, without regard to the fact that she might be much preferable with regard to social issues and minority issues and things like that. In terms of her, in terms of her stature. Well, no, I was going to say, I'm not aware of any, but in whatever you want to say about her, rub-a-da-bang, whatever you want to say about her career, I think it is indisputable that somehow, some way, she became a candidate of choice by elements of the national security establishment, which crossed party lines prior to the election. To come together and to say, hey, we think this guy is a boob, and whatever you do, don't vote for him. So make sure you vote for her. In response to which, enough people voted for him Maybe not a majority, but enough that she didn't have a cakewalk, and she lost that election, and now Donald Trump is here. So it is something different than whatever was intended with regard to why so many recognizable figures associated with the national security establishment wanted us and declared to us that it was in our best interest, it was in everybody's best interest to vote for her. My perception of it, and it's only my opinion, is that she's a pro-war candidate. She is gung-ho about killing people outside of the United States. And, you know, I had the impression that maybe Donald Trump represented a real aberration from the usual business as usual. So while I did not vote for him, I did make Professor Scott laugh on the telephone by saying to him that I voted to make America great again. I wrote in JFK.
I think that's perfect, actually. So tell me, is Donald Trump going against the grain right now? Is he in jeopardy of being manipulated by the deep state in the same sense that JFK was?
Listen, man, I mean, no, not in the same sense that, well...
But I'll tell you why. Okay? And I noticed this. Now, you know,
Okay.
I don't like Hillary. I don't like Donald Trump. Everybody knows that, okay?
That's too bad, because those were our choices.
Well, not if you move to Canada. Then you could have Justin Trudeau, and apparently all the girls like him. So all I have to say, I'm making light, folks, okay? So I know I'm going to get hell from one side, and I'm going to get hell from the other side. I'm after the truth. But I'll tell you this. Donald Trump wanted to bring a peace of some kind, a reconciliation with Russia. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, I've noticed that he's put $55 billion increase into the military. Absolutely. And I'm wondering, is that his choice, or is he being manipulated to it? And now there's boots on the ground in Syria. I worry that here we go again. And all of a sudden, he's $55 billion bucks.
I don't think there's any such thing as here we go again. If here we go again is a description of something that isn't constant. So the constant expansion of the national security state as increasing, you know, military action and expanding upon the military presence, the United States military presence around the world in 80 different countries. How many? 800 military bases. There's a recent book I may have described to you by a guy named David Vine, V-I-N-E, called Base Nation, B-A-S-E Nation. I recommend it. You know, this Orwellian counter speech, this thing where everything pertaining to America's military presence around the world is supposed to be about, here's the word, defense. I think the president of Ecuador,
a lot of places, you know.
Was it Ecuador? It may have been Guatemala. I think it was Ecuador. He was in a position to either sign an agreement so that the United States could maintain a military base there or not. And the only press report that I've read about it, and I'm not up to date about it, this was sometime recently, but I'm not certain how it's been resolved. He made a joke, and he said, yes, he would allow the United States to maintain a military base in his country as long as the United States would allow him to put a base in Miami. And I thought, well, that's the kind of guy I could get along with him probably. But, you know, we've gone pretty far astray off of the work of Dr. Newman. The thing that I want to emphasize with Dr. Newman's work is that this is a real, total immersion in as a history lesson. If you're interested in President Kennedy's death, then you really should. I'm sorry to use this term, but I'm shrugging because I really mean it. You should learn something about his life. And there's a lot of solid ground to represent JFK truthfully as someone who was an opponent of imperialism, whether it was European, whether it was the French in Indochina or the Belgians in the Congo or all kinds of other everything everywhere. He spoke out against American policy in Vietnam as early as 1954. He gave an extraordinary speech about the French occupation of Algeria in 1957. He didn't become a different guy who all of a sudden just wanted to put American military bases all over the world and to exploit, indigenous peoples, indigenous resources. If you look for what I'm telling you, you'll find it. He was a proponent of peace and an advocate of the cautious and diplomatic disassembly of the traditional imperialisms of the 19th and 20th century. It was time.
It was time. And I think you touched on that before. I think far too often when we discuss JFK, automatically we're gravitating towards the assassination and fuzzy pictures and who's this and who's that. And we're losing the bigger picture because it was a complete administration. He was involved in foreign policy, domestic policy, civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. We have to look at the big picture in order to find out why. And once we find out the why, maybe we can find out the who. I think we've already established beyond reasonable doubt that there was indeed more than one shooter in Dealey Plaza that day. I mean, Sherry Feaster's work alone just blows that right out of the water with the fact she's a crime scene investigator, folks. You will find her show, and do get her book in the www.nightfrightshow.com archives. Crime scene investigator examined the Zapruder film, found a frontal shot right away from the South Knoll, right away, 2 shooters, one behind, one in front, probably more. But there we have scientific proof now. So we've established that. But why was he killed? That's still the most important question. Now, that brings me back to a question that Man X asked. That was the most important question in the JFK movie, by that masterpiece by Oliver Stone. Now, Dr. Newman was also instrumental in adding information to that and writing scenes. Can you talk about his contribution to this film, JFK?
I'm glad you asked about that, Brent, because this is something that I think is.
Yeah, I do this for a living. That's how you see the long way around to get to that.
No, I'm pretty sure it's a fluke. But the point
it kind of was, to be honest.
Yeah, the point I would make is that that movie, JFK, which I think should properly be referred to as a masterpiece. It's really a superbly crafted film in every conceivable category, including the score by John Williams and the acting by people who allowed their participation without their usual, requisite compensation that they didn't expect. They agreed to do it for, in certain cases, for no money. But that's not what I'm getting around to. It's a successful film. It's not a documentary, but as a fictitious, as a fictional construct, which includes some elements that have some measure of documentation. It is a masterpiece, and it's the only film of which I'm aware that both Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, both agreed, which they were renowned for not agreeing on a hell of a lot. They thought it deserved to be Best Picture of the Year in that year after it premiered. Dr. Newman's role as a technical advisor on the Vietnam question is something that I think played a significant role in the success of the film. And without the film being as successful as it was, there would have been no public outrage. There would have been no introduction and signing into law of the 1992 President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, and there would have been no Assassination Records Review Board, which is to date the last time the government of the United States has made any effort to examine the documentation that government agencies have maintained pertaining to assassination-related materials, which, in a very timely sort of way, with regard to your question, it's timely because we are finally in the year 2017. October 26th of this year represents the conclusion of the period that was stipulated in the 1992 Records Collection Act. And the work of the ARRB, which went through an enormous quantity of materials, including the Warren Commission materials, the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, the Edwards Committee, the Rockefeller Commission, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. ARRB went through everything. It also required the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and the Secret Service, and other places inside the government to comply by providing either an explanation as to why certain materials should not be released in part or in full, or acknowledge that certain things could be released, which resulted in a gigantic quantity of material being dropped into the National Archives, which is how Dr. Newman followed up JFK and Vietnam 3 years later with a book that absolutely stunned people who thought that they were knowledgeable about the story of Lee Oswald and the story of the government's investigation into the assassination, a book called Oswald and the CIA. So everything is connected, everything is connected. I always say, we've got to back up, let's back up. A lot of work on the assassination starts at 12:30 November 22nd, 1963. And that's not the way Dr. Newman is approaching any of this. This is, a major undertaking. And what it represents is kind of unprecedented. It represents a multi-dimensional, approach across the chronology of many years and the geography of many places.
I just want to back up for a second myself.
Okay.
What scenes did he contribute to in JFK? And then we can move on from that.
He rewrote scenes that featured Donald Sutherland. And he concentrated pretty exclusively on issues relevant to Vietnam. His agreement with Oliver Stone, when Oliver Stone approached him, initiated the contact, and made him a financial offer to participate, it culminated with, let's just say that it included 9 or possibly 10 scenes that Dr. Newman rewrote based upon his understanding and what he could prove with regard to JFK and the conflict that he had with the national security establishment during his period of influence over the issue of America and Vietnam. And so the agreement that Dr. Newman specified was he was not going to express he was not going to address things specifically about President Kennedy's assassination, because at the time Dr. Newman felt that was not something that he was qualified to do. And this guy's a real scholar. He's not trying to float his own boat or toot his own horn. If he doesn't know something, he'll say this is something that requires, more time. So he did not participate in things relevant to issues about the shooting and stuff like that, but he was accepted as an authoritative resource by Oliver Stone to the benefit of the final product, which really impacted American popular culture and made the extraordinary leap from pop culture into law with the 1992 President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, which expires on the 26th of October of this year, and barring an intervention by the President of the United States, who could respond to any kind of petition from a federal agency, and there are a couple of 3-letter agencies to which I would refer, they can petition the president and say, here's some stuff that should not be released because of issues of national security, and that's what it is.
And I was going to say, to me, that Man X scene in JFK, the movie JFK, that is the most important scene of the whole movie, because that asks and begs the question, why was he killed? Played incredibly by Donald Sutherland, who's a Canadian, by the way.
I would say played credibly, but the fact that you keep insisting that only good, awesome people are from Canada, I would have to remind you of all kinds of people that I can rattle off who not so hot. But the same is true of every country on earth, with the exception of Tibet.
Having some fun with Alan again tonight, folks. This is the way we talk. We banter back and forth. We go like this.
Oh,
all
is
the
that
time.
what it is? Thanks for
That's
explaining
what
that,
it is.
because I'm
That's
sure
what it
nobody
is.
would notice.
There's no
Anyway,
other guy I know, Alan, like you. And thank God for that. All that
Yeah.
to say,
No doubt.
who's got their finger on the pulse of the cutting edge, the very, very, very cutting edge of today's deep, profound research in the JFK assassination. And that's because you're connected with all these great researchers, Dr. John Newman, Jeff Morley, Malcolm Blunt, who I was hoping to get to tonight, and we never got around to it. We've got a few minutes left. Do you want to jump into Malcolm
I
Blunt's?
do.
Yeah.
First, I would say that the privileges that I enjoy with regard to my personal and professional relationships with some really extraordinary researchers who, in so many cases, I've found are really extraordinary people. All of this is something that has emerged in my life as the result of the influence of the woman about whom you just referred, or to whom you just referred, Sherry Feaster. Sherry is a person of consequence, not only in terms of the work that is documented in her book, Enemy of the Truth, Myths, Forensics, and the Kennedy Assassination, where she really applied, she wasn't dependent exclusively. I want to make an important correction. She was not dependent exclusively upon analyzing the Zapruder film. She's a career forensic crime scene reconstruction expert with an area of particular expertise in what's called blood spatter analysis. And what she has presented, defining the trajectory cone, which is a term with which I was completely unfamiliar, that redefined in a revolutionary way for me and for quite a lot of other people, including some major people behind the scenes. She redefined what the concept of front means. Because if President Kennedy's head was turned 25.5 degrees to the left of center, 25.5 degrees to the left of the center of the automobile at frame 312 in the Zapruder sequence, that changes what the word front means, because front isn't the proverbial North Knoll. Front is across those three streets, somewhere over there, where she has made an argument with, I think, substantial documentation that at least a single shot was fired, which traversed the right hemisphere of President Kennedy's head, doing a lot of damage, but did not enter into the left hemisphere of his head. And with a protractor and and a human skull, I think you can see a sixth grader with a protractor can see the problem of a shot from the proverbial grassy knoll, if all of what we just referred to is true. So without worrying too much about the details, I'm more interested in why it happened than how it happened. I'm more interested in who was responsible and how they got away with it. And with that, as my objective, to have the privilege of knowing and working with people like Dr. Newman and Jeff Morley and Bill Simpich and my great dear friend, the extraordinary Malcolm Blunt, who may be, well, he is unquestionably one of a small number of the world's leading authorities on the infrastructure of the agency and the internal systems and organization, which are so complicated and so different than what you would think about a federal bureaucracy, but are so essential. It's so essential for this reason.
Got to start to wrap up. We've only got 12 seconds left.
I got it. You got to know what something looks like when it's running the way it's supposed to recognize when there's something abnormal, and that's where Malcolm Blunt has come in. He's the subject of an interview on my site right now, jfkconversations.com.
There you have it, folks. Alan Dale tonight, and like I said, he's the only guy I know with his pulse on the leading edge research in the JFK community. There's some music got to run. Thanks so much, Alan, for coming in as a super
Thank
trooper,
you.
always. And he'll be back, folks, just like Arnold Schwarzenegger says.
Great.
I'm Brent. Well, they're twins, You've seen the movie Twins. There's, you can pick which one Alan plays the Schwarzenegger or the DeVito character. Anyways,
Thanks a lot.
that's okay. Thank you very much, Alan. Seriously.
See ya.
Okay. Brent Holland from Night Fright. See y'all next time.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now, nightfrightshow.com.